This is Rough Drafts Welcome,
the podcast where you can mess up, and we can too.
I'm Sachiko.
And I'm Erin.
And together with the editors at Salt and Sage Books,
we're changing the face of storytelling, one rough draft at a time.
We're glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Rough Drafts Welcome. I'm absolutely thrilled today to be introducing you to my dear friend and one of our incredible editors at Salt and Sage Books. This is Lydia. Hello.
Hi.
I'm so excited to chat with you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We're going to jump right in by asking you about all of the cool pictures on your wall behind you. What are they?
So you know how doctors have like anatomical sketches?
Yes.
Sometimes like on their office as decoration. These are mythological creatures. They're like the skeletal structures, and some of them have muscle structures. And I think there are like some harpy embryos up there too. Okay. But I just really wanted that like big boss energy, like a little bit fantastical, and like we have a Chinese dragon up there too, and minotaurs and all that.
That's beautiful.
It's pretty fun.
For anyone listening on the podcast, she has like this beautiful black wall, and then all of these pictures that are in these gold frames, and they're all in black and white. They're so pretty. What a lovely background you have. All right. Let's just dive right in again with like, who are you? I know who you are, but who are you? Tell the people.
So I am a game designer, game writer, and editor. I've been working with Salt and Sage Books for about 5 years, which has been super awesome, and then game designing for 3. I'm a lifelong gamer, so I've always really been drawn to that, and then it's kind of a dream come true that I get to write now.
You're so cool. Okay, awesome. Lydia really is an incredible editor. I've had her work on some of my pieces too, and just she is top tier. I'm telling you what.
That means a lot coming from you.
I do have feelings about editing. Really, I think you are an incredible editor. All right, let's kind of pivot to what are you like as an editor? I feel like I could describe you, but like, how would you describe yourself? What do you love to edit? What just makes you feel really happy?
As an editor, I am half a cheerleader, like a personal cheerleader, and half like standing next to you with a big wall and the red string. That vibe. And it's like, okay, let's figure this out together. Like, let's see, how these things connect and how to make everything make sense. And so an accomplice, I guess.
An accomplice. What a good way to describe yourself. Lydia, professional accomplice. That is your official new title. Is there anything specific like that you really love editing? Like, is there a genre that you love or an age group that you love to edit for?
I love editing very vulnerable writing. And so I did a Stanford program that was a 2-year program in novel writing. Highly recommend that. And
Stanford grad? Woo woo.
Well, the one thing that my professor told me, my tutorial professor told me, is she said, Lydia, you're writing scared. And you need to not do that, because she's like, all this works really well. You're understanding plot structure. You're understanding a lot of things, but you are writing scared. And I need you to be a little bit braver. And that was the hardest advice for me to get, because I didn't know how to fix that at the time. I knew she was right, but I did not know how to fix that, or where to find that courage, or where to find that voice at the time. And now my favorite thing is editing where I see a lot of very vulnerable pieces of somebody in their work, but I can tell that they're scared and they're not quite leaning into things, either because they're painful or because they feel that maybe it's a bit embarrassing and they don't feel confident enough in that side of themselves. I love coaching somebody through that process, because I figured it out alone, not alone, because I had my Stanford program that helped me. And it was toward the end that I got that advice that was so instrumental to my growth as a writer. But a lot of that like deep introspective work that needed to happen, I did alone and was very hard on myself through. And so it's like at any point where I can streamline that process for somebody, or help kind of hold their hand through it, I feel really happy in doing that. I also can see huge jump in their progress as a writer as that takes place. And so I think it's kind of also about identifying where to be more brave, right? Because like, I mean, we've done therapy, like, and we've talked about this. You know you have things to fix, you don't really know how to get there. And so it's like weirdly being like a book therapist where like I am there for the book. It's not like I am not qualified to be a therapist for people, but for the book or the character in the book, kind of saying what does this character actually want, because this character is making a lot of choices and I can see kind of your direction behind it, but why? And what are they so afraid of? So I guess it goes back to like misbelief and how to present that in a book and kind of put a character through hurdles in a very compelling way that forces them to confront themselves and really figure things out. So I love anything with that. It's very delicious to me. I've done a lot of like coming of age things. And I think as an adult, there are a lot of times where you also have to go through that process, like you kind of find yourself as a teenager in your like early 20s, but then I feel like you find yourself again whenever it is in life as an adult that you start showing up more authentically as yourself. So whatever that process takes place, love it.
Man, I agree so wholeheartedly with that. The idea that we come of age multiple times in our lives is a really compelling one, I think. I also really love that you've got, I feel like you got kind of vulnerable there for a minute, that the whole, like all of the work that you have done has helped you to become who you are. And I love the idea that you can help people feel less alone in that. I think that's awesome.
Thank you.
Okay.
You were a big
go
part
back
of that.
to more like prosaic things. What edits do you currently provide for Salt and Sage?
I do dev editing, which I love to do, developmental editing. So I take a look at a manuscript and we identify things like the plot structure, the pacing, character motives and development. And I absolutely love that. It makes me really happy. I feel like there's kind of this working relationship between an author and their editor, where when you find the right fit, it's kind of magic because as a writer, you know how you want something to come across. And sometimes you're very good at making that happen. And sometimes you need a little bit of help. And this is like the most successful authors as well. All of them have editors, amazing editors behind them. So really kind of like managing that relationship is really fun for me, kind of helping them find their vision and understanding their vision, because sometimes it kind of takes a little while to figure out what they really mean or what they're going for, and then helping them translate that into a way that it will resonate with other people, I think is really cool. And then I also do sensitivity reading, which has been really fun. I mainly read for Chinese American characters, especially mixed race Chinese American characters. I recently did a piece about a white passing mixed race Chinese American character that was really cool, because I am fairly white passing. I guess it just kind of depends which circle I'm in. I was born in Japan and then grew up in the Bay Area, and everybody in the Bay Area is like, "Oh, you're Chinese, interesting." Like they couldn't really like see it in me. But then I spent some time like in the Midwest, and everybody's like, "Hey, you're Mulan, and I'm gonna call you that." I'm like, "What?" And like like the time I spent there, I started like getting ching chonged and all this crazy stuff that I just did not think happened growing up in the Bay Area. And so I guess it's whatever circle you're in that kind of dictates how people see you. But I read a lot for those characters, and I especially like reading stories with a lot of family dynamics in them, because I feel like that's a really compelling part of Chinese culture and Chinese American culture, and it's one that gets that people do wrong a lot of the time. So I feel like
I've heard you've educated me a lot about honor, the idea of honor and how it shows up in so much representation.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Gladly. Always. But there's this kind of misconception in Western media that Chinese people are driven by this idea of honor that they have to chase, and that's the one thing that they care about, and that's how they codify their entire lives is just based on honor. And what that leads to is actually dehumanization, because we are now saying Chinese people care about this one thing and act in accordance with this one thing, or they don't, whatever. But what we really are trying to say, or what I hope people are trying to say in stories about Chinese American characters, when they say honor, I'm just like, let's talk about like loving family relationships. And instead of honor, it being about, you could talk about filial piety or different things like that. But just kind of using one blanket term to describe like a range of human motivations is a little bit restrictive. And I don't know, just knowing different ways that I've been dehumanized by people in my life, or different microaggressions that I've faced. Like Chinese people are just really smart. So, they're robots, everything comes easy to them, that kind of thing. They don't have to try academically. It's so unfair for the rest of us, or whatever garbage, that you hear out there. There are so many people that get pushed into the margins with that kind of talk. And my number one thing as a sensitivity reader, people are people. Like people are people. They all have hopes and dreams. They all have a wide range of motivations and things that they think about and things that they like, and they don't have to like only things from their own culture or things that are stereotypical for them to like, and so I don't know. I just think it's fun to help kind of bridge that gap where a lot of people write Chinese American characters wanting to kind of bring them into this more humanized space. And it's really cool that people are putting so much effort into that now. Like, I love to see it. I'm so excited by that. And I know I have biases. I know I have gaps. I will always use a sensitivity reader any chance I get, for cultures that I don't represent. And even like if I write a book that is going to be published that's about a Chinese character, I will have another Chinese sensitivity reader working on it, because everybody's perspective is so different. Like what they've been through in their lives. It's like everybody's experience as a person from a certain background is valid, but it is one point of information. And as sensitivity readers, we try to be aware of different topics, different kind of pain points that people of a culture might face. And so we try to have a more broad awareness, and that helps us to inform our work and inform our clients. But ultimately, it's like everybody has such different lived experience. And so, like for me, I would want that kind of coverage, for, a character in a book I wrote, just to kind of make sure that it resonates more widely as well.
Thank you. That's such an excellent answer. I'm wondering, well, first, I feel like that is such a theme that we have seen just through Salt and Sage's existence, of the people who are the authors who are doing the work to write characters who are outside of their own lived experience, is that there is often this incredible drive and desire to humanize the characters. And that's often where a lot of the work comes in with the sensitivity readers, is to say, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, it's to say, like, this is how this person is an individual, and this is how their individual personality might be shaped by the culture that they were raised in, that they live in, that they have.
Absolutely. That's a really good way of putting it. So you end up a lot with books where somebody had an idea for a character, and then they kind of afterwards assigned a ethnicity to them. Or you'll have somebody who assigned an ethnicity early on, like looking for more inclusivity in their books, and then built the character out from there. It's really interesting to kind of see how that happens. And like you said, it works best when it's like this multifaceted experience where you plan different parts of the character's personality initially together, and how that happens. Because their experience, and like race is a social construct. And so like that's an important aspect to understand. It's a social construct that doesn't invalidate it as having meaning. It just means that that's something you think about in the way that you build a character. And so it's like, yes, think about how their experience might have impacted their life, not just with marginalization, right? Because if your character comes from a marginalized background, they probably will have had experiences being marginalized, but that's not everything about their relationship with their background. I love to see joy. I love to see a lot of connection and those kinds of things. And my favorite thing to read, just for fun is actually books where you have characters that would be marginalized in a situation, but they're not being marginalized for that. So it might be like lesbian romance where there's a conflict between, the families of the two main characters or something, and it's not about them being lesbian. It's about their jobs or different things like that. And so you're like, in the real world, this might be a point of conflict that's very frustrating and painful for people. But instead, we get to see these really cool stories that are inclusive, but they're focusing on things that like don't trigger kind of that pain and that background. So there's a lot of different stories that are important to tell, whether it's stories of marginalization and perseverance, or they're stories of like, this is just a really fun story with an inclusive cast that does not need to, like break down all of these difficult things. This is just kind of a fun summer read. That's really fun too, especially in fantasy.
Oh man, we've had you and I have had conversations about this before.
We sure have.
The idea that you can, when you're building a fantasy world, you can do literally whatever you want in it. And I've actually learned a lot about this from Helen Gold, who is another of our editors. She talks about how orcs are they're just racist. The presentation of orcs is racist. I've heard the same thing about goblins. But the idea that when you are creating a fantasy novel, a fantasy story, a fantasy game, whatever it is you're making, you have the ability to set up the rules of the world. Like, why are you baking racism into that? Please don't. Don't do that. Why would you bake sexism into your high fantasy? Just have it not be there. You could just write a world that's better.
Yeah, and so one thing I focus on with that big question of, do you include marginalization or do you not include marginalization? Because I've worked on games where that's part of it and games where that's not part of it. And for me, if we're going to talk about marginalization, we're going to do it. We're not going to just like kind of have it be a punchline of gameplay that, oh yeah, this character, is from this like, species or like racial group that we don't like, and that's now a punchline. We don't do that. It's not constructive. It's not even interesting. Like, there's nothing really worth doing there. For me, if we're going to talk about marginalization, we are going to lean into it. We are going to center the person who is experiencing it, not the perpetrator. So like, it's a lot of POV switches, right? Especially like as a GM, it's like everything in session 0 or however you have your safety talks, everything there is going to be respected. If we want to have a game where we do talk about marginalization, we're going to make sure that when it happens, we pass the microphone to the person experiencing it. And even if their character is not going to call it out or make a scene or anything out of it, they get their moment to explain how their character is experiencing this, whether it's like thoughts that they're having or an expression that they make or different things like that. We're going to give them their moment, because that time, what you do as a GM or in the rules of a game, that's kind of, you're saying like, this is how it is, right? And so I feel like as a GM or as a game designer, you have a lot of responsibility to not make marginalization something that's shown as right or acceptable. And so it's always switching. For me personally, I don't really like to focus on marginalization in a lot of my games, just because I've been marginalized at game tables. A lot of people have. For me, that's not the most interesting thing to focus on. I like thinking about safety tools and whatnot, but I have a friend who is non-binary and Black, and they love to focus on marginalization, and they do it so well. They really deconstruct racism and various social prejudices in a way that is very impactful and meaningful and flows well throughout their games. So I think that that's super cool. And I would be very happy to play at their table, but, and like, you never know what you're going to get in a lot of kind of convention games and stuff like that. And so I try to kind of lean away from that, just because it takes a lot of group trust to lean into those problems when you're in a collaborative, storytelling space. And for me, it's kind of important to establish that trust before I do that. And also, that's a big reason why I create a lot of tools for the games I work on, to establish that trust and to maintain that trust within a group.
Thank you. I feel like I could just listen to you listen to you talk all day. Maybe we can.
We always can.
So
we can always talk. Like, I learned so much from you.
Oh, thank you. I'm really curious about, say that you have someone come to you with a piece with a Chinese American character. What do you like to know about the author? Do you like to know anything about like their research or what they've done? Like, do you find that helpful, or do you more like going in with none of that like spare information? Or like how do you approach that? What do you assume about the authors who you're working with? What do you like if they're coming to you? What do you immediately know about them? And then what other things do you like to know or not like to know?
So the main thing I want to know is if they are Chinese, right? If they have any Chinese in their ancestry. I don't really as much need to know if they're best friends with a Chinese person, or if their partner is Chinese, or if their children are part Chinese. I really want to know their background, because if they are Chinese, then again, like that is a Chinese experience to be aware of. And I would never want to invalidate their experience at all, like overriding it with my own experience. It's more going to be like, okay, my experience is another data point for you. Right. And so I want to approach it from that perspective. If they're not Chinese, which most of my clients I work with aren't, again, we do the whole, this is my experience. I am one person, and I try to be aware, of general topics, but kind of, like keep that in mind. And I don't really want to know too much more than that, because I want to experience the story as a Chinese person reading this story. Because that's how it's going to go out into the world at some point, right? And the author's objective and my objective is that when that happens, it will not do harm, number one. And two, hopefully somebody will be seen in that, right? Somebody will feel like it resonates with them. And knowing too much context in the background, if it's not going to translate to the page, isn't very helpful. And so kind of a lot of my process as an editor, whether it's developmental edits or it's sensitivity reads, I'll go through the document, the manuscript, and leave inline comments saying, hey, this is me coming in without background knowledge, right? And I'm going to explain to you how this book is coming across to me in the moment. And that's really helpful to my clients too, because I'll say, hey, I kind of feel like you're building romantic tension here. Very cool. We'll see what happens with that. And they might realize later, like, oh, I really didn't mean for that scene to be, to have romantic tension at all. And like, I try to resist, but so many times I in books, I just feel like I'm like, wait, is this character actually queer though? Because I'm getting so much more tension, right, with like their friend or their frenemy or somebody else than like the romantic lead, the heterosexual
queer coding
lead.
Kills me. It kills me.
I don't mean to say that there's anything like not okay or not valid about having a heterosexual relationship in a book, like it's just like, it doesn't really matter either way. But I think that it's interesting when there's such a compelling argument for a character to be with another character. And it's like, okay, maybe you want to like tone this down a little bit if you really want them to be with a romantic lead, because people are going to be excited about these other two characters. You're going to ship them so hard, it's going to be distracting, right? Yep. Or maybe sometimes I love it when they come back and they're like, just like, okay, wait, maybe let's see, let's just see. And so that's always fun. It's like whatever you do with it is up to you, but it's kind of interesting to go through that process, because when they get feedback like that back, it tells them like, oh, this is like, they get to read my brain when I'm reading this book. And I'm like, how cool is that to read a reader's brain about your story? And I love it when people I work with, critique partners or editors will send me back work and they explain kind of like, they let me read their brain in their feedback. I think that that's so fun, because I'm like, oh, wow, I never thought about that. It's just really interesting.
Sachiko first introduced me to that idea of sensitivity reading as market research. Like if you're writing a book about Chinese Americans, odds are pretty high that Chinese Americans are going to pick it up. So you should probably be aware of what your audience might think as they're reading your book.
Yeah, and that's one thing, just to I kind of bring things back to games a lot because that's what I do professionally also. But with games, I'm like, anytime we have a game that represents people of a certain ethnic background, like we want to make sure it's safe and fun for them to play, right? Because like how sad when you have a product come out that somebody might kind of see it on a shelf and be like, ooh, cool, that I feel like that resonates with me in my background. That represents me, cool. And then they pick it up and they start reading through it and they're like, ooh, this does not represent me.
Yeah.
You know? And they put it back and it's kind of like this sigh moment of like, well, that's fine. You know, like that's kind of how it is and it's fine. But I don't know. I just really feel like because we don't have as much rep for a lot of people of different backgrounds, it's like when we have that, let's make sure that they feel seen in it. Let's make sure that it's something that feels good to them.
I think that is incredibly important. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left in the time that we wanted to do, so I'm going to skip right to the end here, and we will go into just the final questions that I ask everybody. What is your very favorite book? And I've modified this question based on the advice of the other people who I've talked to who've been like, this is an impossible question. And I know I couldn't answer it. So favorite book or favorite one you've read recently or one that was really impactful to you or one that you go back to a lot or like favorite book when you were a teenager, something along those lines. Give us a book recommendation, please.
Okay. So, I've been writing triad urban fantasy for the past oh goodness, how long has it been? Like 6 years or something that I've been writing triad urban fantasy. And I have had people tell me point blank, there is no market for this, right? And then a wonderful author named Fonda Lee came into the writing scene and proved everybody wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the Greenbone Saga, it's a series that she's written. So Jade City being the first is phenomenal. It will blow your mind. It is so good. I want it to be like an HBO or Netflix series so bad. I think about this all the time. But anyway, if you love...
This book is your Roman Empire.
Triad. Yep. And you love magic. There's some really cool Jade magic in that series. And the magic system's phenomenal. The Chinese family dynamics are done so well. And the way that Chinese culture is incorporated into the story is really innovative, but also feels very true to its roots. Mm-hmm. And so it's set in a fictional world with different cultures that are kind of coded as real life cultures to varying degrees. And it's really cool because she world builds in ways that, clearly are abstract from our real world, but show sort of a interracial discourse in a very interesting and respectful way, even when the characters are not being respectful about it, which is really cool.
That's a fine line to walk.
Hard to do, right?
Will you tell us the name again of the first book and the author?
Jade City by Fonda Lee. It is so good, you will not have regrets.
Well, I know what I am reading tonight.
There is some adult content in there, so just be aware of that. I wouldn't recommend it, to children or young teens or anything like that. So just kind of be aware. But such a magnificent
I am neither
series.
a child nor a young teen, so I will be reading it tonight. I'm excited.
Absolutely.
That's a good one. Okay. Do you have a favorite animal? And if so, what is it?
Bunnies. So much bunnies. I had a rabbit when I was younger, and bunnies just make me happy. And so I'll send my friends little rabbit stickers on different letters or packages I send them, and it's always just kind of a fun thing.
I did not know that you had bunnies. That's wonderful. I've only recently learned that you can have rabbits in the house, and it's kind of I heard someone describe it as similar to a cat.
They can be litter trained.
Yeah. That's so cool. So
yeah.
Well, if you ever get a rabbit again, I'm going to come and visit.
Come visit, hang out on my
I'll come visit anyway. All right. Okay. I know it's impossible to pick one, but do you have a preference between audiobooks, physical books, and digital books?
I like audiobooks a lot. you kind of get two performances, one from the writer and one from the narrator, which is really fun. But also, I was a late reader growing up, which was kind of something I used to be very embarrassed about as a child. I didn't realize some of it was kind of just, dyslexia and ADHD. And so now it's interesting because I work as an editor and a writer, and I love reading. It is so easy for me to consume material through like hearing it, and I have really good recall with that. With reading, it takes my full attention, and I'm a slower reader, but also when I'm editing, I kind of pause to think through things and then resume. And so I'm quite a bit slower that way. But I always like editing, obviously with written, with reading it. But just for fun, I love audiobooks. I can clean my house and get different things I need to done at the same time as enjoying a book and being transported to a different world. So
I love that. You and I have talked about this, but one of my children has some processing difficulties and also struggles with reading. And I think we don't talk often enough about how audiobooks are such a game changer for accessibility reasons. Because like this child will consume books if they are in an audio format. But even being read to feels very stressful to them because then they're aware that like they're not able to read the words. So I think audiobooks are incredible. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, and I have a child who's a very good reader, and it's pretty amazing. He reads like 2 or 3 grade levels above his grade in school. Yeah, and I am just shocked because I'm like, oof, when I was your age, I literally developed an anxiety disorder in part because we had a read out loud circle in class, and I was painfully shy and you could not pass. And every day I would worry about that. And so it's really interesting now, like seeing my child do so well and be at the top of his class with his reading and just kind of be in awe of that because I've worked with him on it, but like not to the extent that it would have done me enough good at that age,
right?
And so it's just really interesting, but it's kind of interesting to gain that perspective too with neurodivergence, and we're both neurospicy, you and I. And so it's really interesting kind of gaining that perspective about how minds work so differently. And if you frame it in a kind of a perspective of deficiency, you miss out on so much.
Gosh, yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's just not even like an accurate way to look at things. And so it's really cool to figure out how other people's brains work and see that there's like so much capacity and merit. And yeah, I don't know, just like a lot of different facets to how brains work. That's really cool.
They really are. I like that we live in a world that is becoming more aware of and more accessible to those things, just like to the different ways that all of our brains works or our brains work and the different ways that our bodies work too. Like I had no idea that there were so many things that could happen with your eyeballs. And I am now like so much more informed about that because we're dealing with visual processing things. And like, I had no clue. I just didn't know. I think so much of accessibility, like if you look at a thing and you're like, well, that's silly. I think what that shows is that you don't know how that is changing the world for someone.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I remember I had to get an MRI once, and we weren't looking for this, but my doctor was like, oh, like you have this kind of like your part of your brain is shaped a little bit differently, and that affects depth perception. And I've always had really bad depth perception with like driving and different things. And so it's just really interesting. It was like so weirdly validating for me because I was like, oh, that's why I was never good at sports. Like I loved archery and was good at that growing up, but like I was not good at sports where you like throw a ball and catch it, and it was always just so frustrating for me. I felt like I was lacking in some way. And just to know like, oh, that's just kind of the way my brain is shaped and works is just mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, and then you can work with it instead of, the way it shows up for me is feeling like I'm a failure. But if I know that like, it's not like I can just push through, it's that I need different accommodations. That for me has been really like life-changing, not just in the way that I live my life, but also in the way that I like understand myself. there's so much more compassion that I have for myself now.
I agree. It's kind of interesting because there's this pushback on inclusivity and diversity. It's just like, oh, we shouldn't tell people they're different in different ways. We should just let them all feel like they're the same or something like that, because then they'll feel bad because they're different. And it's like the only thing making them feel bad for being different is saying that they should feel bad for being different, right? Or being treated that way. Whereas it's just like you said, I think a lot of people have this feeling deep down like there is something different or unlovable or strange about them that's somehow unaccounted for, and it's just like a deficiency within them. And I think especially as creatives, we get so sucked into that if we give that space, right? And it's very easy to. So if we give that space, it can just consume us and take so much of our talent and focus away. Whereas like just understanding like I'm different and that's fine. I just live my life in a way that makes sense for who I am.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm good to other people. Like that's all there is to it.
I think that's really the core of it, is that I feel like the more that you learn to love and accept who you are, the more capacity that you have to do that for other people. And I feel like for me, that's why diversity in writing and in games and in film and in media of all sorts is so, so, so crucial, because you get that humanization of people who don't look like you or don't believe like you or whatever it may be. But then you also get to understand the world through their point of view. And I feel like the more that we read things that are outside of our own experiences, the more that we understand just the depth of humanity all around us, and really the less alone that we then feel. Because we see that it's not just me who feels like a failure. It's, I mean, probably all of us feel like that at some point or another.
Yeah, and it definitely manifests differently in different people, you know, whether they choose to like internalize that or to project it outwards and maybe not treat other people well. Everybody, you know, has a different way of exhibiting that, you know, and so it's kind of interesting. But I don't know, it's interesting too, because I feel like we limit ourselves a lot by telling ourselves stories about us that aren't true.
Gosh,
and
yes.
there might be something, it's like, okay, you know, maybe I could never be good at sports because of that depth perception. That is a big limiting factor for me, right? And I'm not very like interested in sports, in most of them. And so like, unless we're talking esports or archery, I'm really not. And so that's fine for me. I accept that. I'm cool. There are other things that I thought I was not good at, and that's because I was not giving myself a chance, you know, to learn. And because my fear of not being good at it made learning harder.
Oh, man. We could have a whole... We're just going to have you back. That's what I'm thinking, because I want to talk to you.
Anytime.
I want to talk to you about the idea that we have to be good at something the first time we try it. And that, like, if you can't write a perfect first draft, then you have failed. Ooh, okay. I'm gonna make
That'd be such a small group of writers that were ever very successful from the very first thing that they wrote. Like, I don't know how small that pool of people would be over the existence of humanity, but like, I mean,
it's got to be like maybe one person in every like 10 billion humans. Like, it's just not. But yet we put all that pressure on ourselves. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm totally going over and getting distracted. I've written that down.
No, you're good.
We'll talk about it. All right, good. To wrap us up, what is one thing you would want anyone who's listening, what do you want them to know?
Probably just going off of the last thing that we talked about is don't put pressure on yourself to succeed at a certain point in time. Because when I started writing, I wanted writing to be my whole life, and it was all I could think about. Even when I was working office jobs, you know, I'd work and then right at 5 p.m. my brain would switch to writer mode, and I'd think about it, commuting and whatnot. I desperately wanted to be one of these success stories where at 22 years old or 23 years old, you have a breakout novel that hits the top of the New York Times bestseller list. I'd always dreamed about that. And now I know enough about myself to know that would have been the worst thing to happen to me in a writing career. Because if I had peaked young, all of that negative self-talk I had back then would have consumed me. Because so many people who peak young, it ends up being a blessing and a curse. The curse being that suddenly there's all this pressure on them, and maybe they're newer writers that have only been doing this for a few years, and then they have the pressure of competing with books written by people with decades of experience or different things like that. And they just expect themselves to be as good. And all of their reader base and everybody else expects them to always, hit the mark of wherever their first book was, or to do even better than that. And that is just such an exhausting idea. And I say this, with like some people who peak young do an amazing job with that. And they have a great career, and it's very satisfying for them. But if you are frustrated with the idea that you are not peaking young, just understand that if that's not part of your story, that could be a very good thing for you, right? Like, we just have all this pressure on ourselves to try to control things that are outside of our control. But what we can control that will always be useful to you, whether you peak young or you peak later, whatever, it will always be useful for you to have had a lot of practice as a writer, for you to have learned a lot and experienced a lot. Like, that growth is not wasted. Every book that you write, and I know you talk about this a lot too, is not wasted. You learn different things. And so we can't control as creatives when we become successful or what level of success we obtain. That is not something we really have a lot of control over. We can do things that increase our likelihood, right? By putting ourselves out there. But we cannot truly control that. And so the one thing that has been helpful for me that I hope is helpful to anyone listening is focus on improving yourself so that whenever things fall into line for you, you are ready and you can make that your best time to have succeeded. And then to have like hopefully a very happy and long career doing what you love.
I love that. What good advice. Okay. Thank you so much. We will definitely be having you back onto the podcast. It is just a pleasure to chat with you.
Likewise.
Okay. We will see you guys next time. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.
This has been Rough Drafts Welcome.
Thank you so much for listening.
Got any questions? We would love to hear them. Got a complaint? We'll hear it too.
Yep. Leave us a 5-star review. Pretty please. And thank you. And if you want to book with Salt and Sage Books or learn anything else about what we do, or if you want to work with us or take our courses or blah, 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 you can find us at www.saltandsagebooks.com. And we're all over social media too.
We sure are.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.